3D imaging technicians scanned 2 mummies and took over 50,000 images to help get a glimpse into their lives. Her ancient findings make our moment.
2 women, a rock shelter carved into the stone face of the Libyan desert. 7,000 years of silence. That is where this story begins. Not in a laboratory, not in a museum, in the sand, under 2 centimeters of desert, where 2 naturally mummified women had been lying undisturbed since before the Egyptian pyramids existed, before the Roman Empire, before writing itself. When scientists finally extracted DNA from their bones and ran it against nearly 1,000 genomes from across the world, the results didn't just surprise them. They broke the existing model. One of the lead geneticists on the project said that if he had been handed these genomes with no date attached, he would have guessed they were 40,000 years old. They weren't. They were 7,000. But what was inside those bones was something far older. A bloodline that science had no record of. A population that had existed for 50,000 years without leaving a single mark in any history we have ever written. A ghost hiding in plain sight inside the oldest desert on Earth. This is the story of who they were, what they carried, and why finding them may force us to rewrite everything we thought we understood about where modern humans came from. The world before the sand. Before anything else, you need to destroy the image of the Sahara that you currently carry in your head. Whatever you are picturing right now, the endless walls of orange dunes, the cracked earth, the air that shimmers with heat at 50 degrees, erase it. Because 7,000 years ago, none of that existed. The coordinates were the same. The continent was the same. The world sitting on top of it was completely unrecognizable. 7,000 years ago, southwestern Libya was a savanna, not a scrubby patch of dry grass. A full, breathing, water-rich savanna with permanent lakes and river systems that would look normal running through Central Africa today. Hippos wallowed in those waters. Elephants moved through the grasslands in herds. The fish in the rivers were so abundant that people built communities around catching them. This was not a brief wet season. This was a geological epoch. Between roughly 14,000 and 5,000 years ago, a climate event called the African Humid Period transformed the Sahara from the world's largest hot desert into one of the most fertile regions on the planet. Monsoon rains pushed north. The land absorbed them, and life moved in from every direction, filling the green corridor that now stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Nile Valley. The biodiversity that packed into that landscape in those thousands of years rivaled anything alive in modern Europe today. The same coordinates, a completely different Earth. And into that world came people. One of the places they settled was a rock shelter called Takarakori, nestled into a stone cliff face in what is now the Fezzan region of southwestern Libya. The surrounding rocks were already ancient when the first families arrived. The land offered shelter from the sun, access to water, and open grassland that could sustain animals and crops alike. People took one look at it and stayed. Generation after generation, for more than 8,000 years, that single location was home to a continuous human community whose existence we had no record of until a team of scientists drove out into the dead remnants of their world in 2003. The shelter and its secrets. Before the first shovel touched the ground at Takarakori, the team already knew they were standing somewhere extraordinary. The rock faces surrounding the shelter were covered in engravings, thousands of them. Carved images of cattle with enormous sweeping horns, giraffes, crocodiles, human figures moving through scenes of daily life. Animals that had not lived anywhere near this region for thousands of years, preserved on stone in precise, deliberate lines. The team was standing inside the visual record of a vanished civilization before they had uncovered a single bone. The excavation revealed the remains of 15 individuals, and the pattern of who had been buried at Takarakori immediately demanded attention. The dead were almost entirely women and children, not warriors, not rulers, not the kind of high-status burials that dominate the archaeological record in most ancient sites. Women and children laid into the earth with deliberate, careful attention. That pattern is telling you something. Burial is not a biological instinct. It is a social decision. Someone in that community had a system, a set of beliefs about who deserved to be returned to the earth and how. The women and children buried at Takara were not accidental. They were chosen, which means the people who chose them had rituals, had theology, had a framework for understanding death that was sophisticated enough to produce a consistent burial practice across many generations. 2 of the 15 individuals were in a condition that stopped the excavation team cold. Their skin was still there, not bone, skin, darkened and pulled tight by thousands of years of dry desert air, but intact. Their tissue was still attached. Their ligaments had not dissolved. In the extreme heat cycling of the Saharan environment, scorching by day, cold by night, organic material disintegrates fast. It falls apart at the molecular level. Every previous attempt to recover usable biological material from human remains in comparable North African desert conditions had produced nothing. Every single attempt. These 2 women were different. They had been naturally mummified by the desert itself, preserved in a way that had never been documented before at this kind of site. And that preservation was about to change the entire field of ancient genetics. The dig, the DNA, and the near impossible. Getting DNA out of ancient human remains from a hot desert environment was considered essentially impossible. Heat is the enemy of genetic material. It breaks the chemical bonds in DNA strands. It fragments the sequences. It corrupts the data until what remains is noise rather than information. Cold environments, Siberian permafrost, European cave sites, frozen mountainsides, have given scientists extraordinary ancient genomes. The hot world has given almost nothing. The Sahara, specifically, had produced 0 usable ancient human DNA before this project. The failure rate was total. The team from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, led by geneticist Nadia Savino-Salem, knew that soft tissue, even the preserved skin visible on these 2 women, would not carry viable genetic material. The heat had already done too much damage to the surface structures, so they went deeper. They went for the hardest material in the human body. They drilled into the teeth. They drilled into the petrous bone, the dense section at the base of the skull that encases the inner ear. These are the places where genetic material shelters longest, locked inside crystalline structures that resist environmental damage more effectively than any other tissue. But drilling meant destroying. There was no reversing it. No way to put back what had been taken. The team extracted material from irreplaceable 7,000-year-old remains with no guarantee that anything viable would come out the other side. What came out was enough. Complete genome sequences. The first whole genomes ever recovered from human remains found in a hot, arid environment anywhere on Earth. Johannes Krauss, the senior author of the study and director of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, did not try to understate what had just happened. These are among the oldest mummies in the world, he said. That we could sequence their entire genomes is a small miracle. A barrier that had held for decades had been broken, and the data sitting behind that barrier was going to force scientists to tear up assumptions they had held for years. The bloodline that should not exist. Before the results came back, the team had one assumption they were completely confident in. During the African humid period, the Sahara was an open, connected landscape. Populations moved freely across it. The green corridor that stretched from west to east across the continent had turned North Africa into a bridge between sub-Saharan populations and Mediterranean ones. Geography, ecology, and every model of human migration pointed in the same direction. The Takarakori women would carry DNA linking them to sub-Saharan African populations. It was the only logical outcome. It was treated almost as a formality, something to confirm rather than discover. The confirmation never came. The Takarakori women carried 0 sub-Saharan African ancestry. Not a trace, not a fragment buried under layers of later mixing. Nothing. These 2 women had lived during the most genetically open period in Saharan history, in a landscape that connected the entire continent, surrounded by trade and movement and contact with the outside world. And yet, not a single genetic thread ran south from them. The scientists went looking for the closest match in the existing record. What they found was not nearby, and it was not recent. The nearest known relatives of the Takarakori women were 15,000-year-old hunter-gatherers buried in a cave called Tafaralt, in what is now Morocco. A population that had lived thousands of kilometers away, thousands of years earlier, in a completely different part of North Africa. And yet the genetic connection between them and the Takarakori women was undeniable. The same deep ancestral thread running through both groups and found nowhere else on Earth. The Tafaralt people were already strange. Their remains showed evidence of deliberate, systematic tooth removal, not from decay or injury, but by choice. Healthy teeth pulled from living mouths as a form of ritual identity. This was a practice written painfully and permanently onto the body. These were people who marked themselves irreversibly as an act of social belonging, and they were the closest known relatives of the women buried at Takarakori. What both populations shared was membership in a lineage that had no connection to sub-Saharan Africa whatsoever. A lineage that had existed along the northern edge of the continent for tens of thousands of years, unnamed, unknown, invisible to science until this moment. But scientists had actually been detecting faint traces of this population for years without being able to find them. In the DNA of modern North Africans, researchers kept encountering a strange, ancient signal, a genetic pattern that didn't match anything in the record, that appeared consistently across multiple studies, that could be measured but not sourced. It had been there all along. They just had no body to attach it to. They gave it a name the way scientists name things they cannot yet explain. They called it a ghost population. Lead researcher Nadia Salem was direct about what Takarakori had just produced. Our research challenges previous assumptions about North African population history, she said, and highlights the existence of a deeply rooted and long isolated genetic lineage. Louise Humphrey of the Natural History Museum in London stated it plainly. The DNA pointed to a previously unknown ancient lineage. In 2023, a branch of humanity that had never appeared in any historical or genetic record had just been found. Frozen while the world moved. Once researchers confirmed that the Takarakori women belonged to a distinct, isolated lineage, they pushed further back to understand how old that isolation really was. What they found was staggering. The closest genetic parallel to the Takarakori women outside North Africa was a set of 50,000-year-old individuals from a site called Zlatý Kun in what is now the Czech Republic, part of the very first wave of modern humans ever documented outside the African continent. The people at that site represented the earliest known migration of Homo sapiens into Europe, and the Takarakori women were more closely related to those 50,000-year-old individuals than to any sub-Saharan African population alive today. Read that again, slowly. 7,000-year-old women buried in Libya, more closely related to the first humans to walk into Europe 50,000 years ago than to anyone living south of them on their own continent. The picture researchers assembled from this was precise. At some point, during or immediately after the first out-of-Africa migration, a group split away from or turned back from the main movement. They returned to, or remained on, the northern edge of the African continent. And then they stopped mixing. For 50,000 years, this lineage reproduced internally. No significant genetic material came in from the populations around them. Now, consider what 50,000 years of human history actually looks like. The Neanderthals went extinct. The last ice age rose, peaked, and collapsed. The first cities appeared in Mesopotamia. Egypt constructed the pyramids and built a civilization that lasted 3,000 years. Greece rose and fell. Rome rose and fell. The Renaissance happened. The Industrial Revolution happened. Humans developed language, agriculture, metallurgy, writing, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. We launched rockets into space. We landed on the moon. We split the atom. All of recorded human history, every war, every empire, every invention, every discovery that has ever made it into a book, occupies less than 1/10 of the time this population spent genetically unchanged in North Africa. But here is the part that makes no sense. These people were not isolated from the world in the way that phrase usually implies. They had sheep and goats and cattle. Animals domesticated in the Near East, which means those animals arrived through contact with outside groups. The pottery found at Takarakori had been imported from sub-Saharan Africa and from the Nile Valley. Trade routes reached them. Ideas reached them. Their material culture shows the fingerprints of every major civilization that existed anywhere near them. They absorbed technology. They absorbed animals. They absorbed ideas. And they let none of it touch their DNA. Lead researcher Savino commented on it directly. We know now that they were isolated in terms of genetics, but not in cultural terms. Johannes Krauss described them as living fossils, clinging to their ancestral roots. Researchers noted that nothing comparable had ever been documented in Europe, where constant population mixing had long since erased any genetic continuity on this scale. This was not accident. This was not geography. The Green Sahara was open. Outside groups could reach them, and did reach them. The physical evidence confirms it. For 50,000 years, someone was making a choice to keep the bloodline closed, generation after generation. A decision so consistent and so ancient that it outlasted every civilization that has ever existed. The memory of the first crossing, buried deeper in the genome data, older than the isolation and older than the green Sahara, was something that made even the most experienced researchers pause. Approximately 50,000 years ago, an ancestor of this lineage had a child with something that was not fully human. That is not metaphor. That is what the DNA shows. The Takarakori women carried Neanderthal DNA, approximately 0.15% of their total genome. That number needs context to mean anything. Most people alive today whose ancestry runs through Europe or Asia carry between 1.5 and 2% Neanderthal DNA, the accumulated result of multiple rounds of interbreeding that happened as modern humans pushed deeper into Neanderthal territory over tens of thousands of years. The Takarakori women carried roughly 1/10 of that amount, more than most sub-Saharan Africans who carry almost none, far less than any European or Asian population. That fraction is not random noise, it is a timestamp. It marks the exact moment in human history when this lineage made contact with Neanderthals and then stopped. The researchers' conclusion was specific. The ancestors of the Takarakori women encountered Neanderthals during the first wave of the out-of-Africa migration, approximately 50,000 years ago. They picked up that genetic trace right at the beginning of that journey. Then, at some point, they separated from the main migrating population, returned to the northern edge of Africa, and that original Neanderthal inheritance was never added to again, never diluted, never refreshed by further contact. It sat in their cells, at the same concentration, untouched, for 50,000 years. The connection to Zikun becomes significant here in a specific way. The woman found at that Czech site carried the longest, least fragmented Neanderthal DNA sequences of almost any ancient human ever identified. That places her at the absolute earliest moment of human Neanderthal interbreeding, as close to the original event as the fossil record has ever come. The Takarakori ancestors were part of the same lineage. Researchers believe these women's DNA preserves a record of Neanderthal contact that is cleaner and less overwritten than almost anything science has found elsewhere. It is worth spending a moment on what Neanderthals actually were, because the word carries a connotation it does not deserve. By 50,000 years ago, Neanderthals had been living across Europe and Western Asia for at least 200,000 years. They made complex tools. They buried their dead. They cared for their injured and elderly. Skeletal remains show healed fractures that could only have been survived with communal support. There is growing evidence that they created art. These were not primitive creatures stumbling through the dark. They were a separate human species with their own long history, their own social structures, their own relationship with the world. The meeting preserved in the Takarakori genome was not a collision between intelligence and something lesser. It was a meeting between two kinds of human being. And the biological record of that meeting, that one convergence 50,000 years ago, was still sitting readable inside two women who died 7,000 years ago in a Libyan rock shelter. The Neanderthals vanished from the earth approximately 40,000 years ago. The Taki women died 7,000 years ago. That means they were carrying the genetic memory of a species that had been extinct for 33,000 years before they themselves were ever born. The slow erasure. No army came for them. No plague moved through the population. No rival group pushed them out of the rock shelter or drove them from the grasslands. What ended the ghost population was something that had no awareness of their existence. The African humid period ended. The world that had kept this lineage alive for 50,000 years simply stopped being what it was. The collapse, based on climate models, was not gradual in any human sense of the word. Researchers believe the transition from green Sahara to desert took centuries in some areas, which in human terms means it happened fast enough to be catastrophic within a single lifetime. The lakes shrank first, their shorelines pulling back from communities that had been built around permanent water. Then, the rivers slowed and dried. The grazing lands that had sustained the cattle herds turned to dust. The animals that had filled this landscape for thousands of years either moved or died. The people who had built everything they knew inside this world had nowhere to run to. The rock art tells the story in its own way. For thousands of years, the people of the Green Sahara had been carving images across the stone faces of the region. Cattle, human figures, wildlife, scenes of herding and movement and daily life. As the aridification accelerated, those images changed. The subjects shifted. The carvings became sparse. And then they stopped. No final declaration, no record of departure. The last people who made them simply walked away and left the stone blank. The silence after the last engraving is total. As the infrastructure of their world dissolved, the trade routes that required water, the grazing networks that required grass, the social connections that required the ability to move and meet, the conditions that had allowed this population to remain genetically separate while culturally connected collapsed with it. The boundaries they had maintained for 50,000 years required a functioning green world to exist. Without that world, those boundaries could not hold. They were absorbed into the broader North African populations moving around them. Their language disappeared. Their social structures dissolved into larger ones. Their specific knowledge of how to live inside the Green Sahara became useless information in a desert. A lineage that had survived ice ages, climate shifts, and 50 millennia of contact with the outside world was finally undone, not by anything that targeted it, but by the ground disappearing beneath it. Some researchers believe the collapse of the Green Sahara directly contributed to the rise of pharaonic Egypt. The theory holds that populations displaced by the dying landscape pushed eastward into the Nile corridor, bringing cattle-herding knowledge, social organization, and the accumulated skills of thousands of years of settled life. That influx of people and expertise, the argument goes, was part of what drove the extraordinary complexity that produced one of history's greatest civilizations. The Takarakori people had been trading with Nile Valley communities before the collapse. It is possible they contributed something to that process: knowledge, animals, people, without leaving a single traceable mark in any record we have ever found. What the desert still keeps. The ghost population is gone as a distinct entity, but it did not vanish completely. Fragments of their genetic signature survive today inside the DNA of living North Africans, most strongly among the Amazigh communities who have inhabited the region for millennia. There are millions of people alive right now who carry a trace of this lineage in their cells, not a memory, not a story. A measurable biological inheritance from a population that was unknown to science until 2023. They have no name for what their ancestors were. There is no oral history that reaches back far enough to describe them. There is only the signal, quiet, inside the genome, waiting to be read. And the Takarakori women are almost certainly not alone. The Sahara covers an area roughly the size of the continental United States. Beneath its surface, under the sand that has been accumulating in some places for thousands of years, are the remains of every community that ever lived through the Green Period and died when it ended. Researchers believe there are more naturally preserved bodies lying in rock shelters across Libya, Algeria, Chad, and Niger, each one potentially carrying genome sequences that have never been analyzed, each one potentially rewriting another piece of the story. The extreme heat that makes DNA recovery so difficult also, paradoxically, drives the natural mummification that makes recovery possible at all. The same environment that destroys genetic material in most conditions also, under the right circumstances, creates the preservation that protects it. The Sahara has been keeping these people in its own way. 2 centimeters below the surface, where a brush drawn through the sand finds a jawbone. What the 2 women from Takarakori revealed is not the end of anything. It is the first opening in a much larger vault. A lineage invisible to science for 50,000 years was found in 2023. A ghost population that science could measure but never locate was finally given a physical face. The barrier on ancient DNA recovery from hot desert environments, a barrier that had held for decades, was broken by 2 women who had been lying in Libyan sand since before the written word existed. And the desert is vast, and it is not finished giving back what it took. Somewhere out there, under the sand, the rest of this story is still waiting.